The stigma would be marginally more understandable if it were applied only to superheroes and not the comics form as a whole. The superhero genre requires a certain suspension of disbelief that simply makes it unacceptable to some people. And I can't deny that mainstream comic books are overpopulated by superheroes. What strikes me as ridiculous is the fact that the public refuses to acknowledge that comic books are capable of dealing with anything outside of the superhero milieu, despite the mountain of evidence to the contrary. The entire form is written off based on one of its many genres. If this same logic were extended to other media, then wouldn't television be considered total trash based on the multitude of reality shows? Would movies all be grouped together with Dude, Where's My Car? After all, nobody ever says, movies? Nah, those are too goofy for me. TV shows? Ha, those are just for kids. The truth is, superheroes aren't even the predominant genre. In looking through a recent Diamond Previews catalog, which lists all of the comic books being distributed to the direct market in a given month, I began tallying the comic books that could be classified as superheroes and those that could not. To give a bit of background, all of the major publishers' books are listed up front in previews. First Dark Horse, then DC, then Marvel, then Image. All of the independent books are listed in the back of the catalog alphabetically by publisher. I even balanced the scales against my argument by counting any book that could even be remotely construed as a superhero comic as such. After going through just the 4 major publisher sections, the non-superhero count was only trailing by 9 titles, 115 to 124. Independent publishers are far less likely to print superhero comics, and before I'd even reached the C's in the back section, the non-superhero book count had increased by 50, and the superheroes by only 1. Just scanning quickly through the rest of the independents made it pretty clear what the outcome would be, and even then, the figures wouldn't include the abundance of independent and self-published comics that aren't distributed by Diamond, and thus not listed in previews. The notion that comic books are primarily a medium devoted to superheroes is categorically wrong. To further illustrate how preposterous the stigma attached to comic books is, let's take another quick look at a couple of related media: newspaper strips and magazines. Millions of people read and are entertained by newspaper comic strips every day, and are bothered by none of the disrepute associated with comic book readers. Why is it that comic strips are deemed more acceptable than comic books? There are 2 probable reasons, if not more. Artists on comic strips were considered the true artists, making great amounts of money and held in esteem. They had practiced their craft for some time and made a good living at it. The most respected newspapers employed the best cartoonist, and an elitist hierarchy developed. Comic book artists, as I've mentioned, were the exact opposite, paid to produce as much work in as little time as possible, and were rarely at the peak of their careers. They were therefore viewed as being talentless hacks who were at the bottom rung of the artist's ladder, however untrue that may have been. Further, comic strips were not produced in the assembly line fashion employed by comic book publishers. Cartoonists on comic strips generally did all of the work by themselves, with the occasional exception of those who employed assistants to do the lettering. Ghostwriters and ghost artists were other exceptions, but a single name was still associated with the work. In the early years of the comic book industry, comic book artists were rarely credited for their work, and in some cases a single page of art would have several pencilers or inkers. On the other hand, it was quite common for newspaper cartoonists to become synonymous with their comic strips and their characters. Consequently, comic strips were viewed as the work of a singular creative mind and worthy of more respect. The other reason for the higher acceptance of the comic strip form boils down to convenience. Comic strips are printed in newspapers, and newspapers are a fact of everyday life for most Americans. They're delivered to millions of homes and are fairly ubiquitous. Comic books, however, must be specifically purchased at specialty stores or more recently online. A special effort, albeit a small one, is required to obtain them, even when comic books were widely available at newsstands. This was the case. Comic strips have had the distinct advantage of being wrapped in a grown-up package. Nobody seems to mind if a person reads the comic strip section of a newspaper because it's something of a side dish to the main course of the news. Since newspapers are so widely available, there's no real deviation from the norm, perceived or otherwise, in reading comic strips. All of this, of course, doesn't make it any less silly. The comic book is a direct descendant of the comic strip, and the difference between the comic strip and the comic book has little bearing on their worth as art forms. One of the main differences between comic books and comic strips is that strips are usually designed to cater to a much more general readership and are at the mercy of newspaper editors and syndicates. The other significant difference is simply the matter of composition. One has multiple pages. The other is a brief sequence of panels, although multi-page strips are not unheard of. That physical difference is what gives comic books their own visual language. But to say that it makes a comic book inferior to a comic strip makes little sense. Both are equally valid forms of expression. Magazines, like newspapers, are viewed as more agreeable form of entertainment in the eyes of society at large. Many magazines feature sequential art. These magazines are distributed to the same outlets as other magazines and are immune not only to the comics code, but also to the prejudice exercised against comic books. Ridiculous. The same content present in comic books is printed in these magazines. The only real difference is the format. That the comics code completely ignored these magazines belies the fact that somehow children were less likely to have access to magazines than comic books, despite the fact that at the time, the two shared the same distribution channels and were available at the same place.